Some photographs don't just document a moment, they define an era. Martyn Goddard's images of Blondie do exactly that, capturing the band just as they were on the verge of becoming icons. Martyn built his career at the intersection of music, culture, and photography. His images of Debbie Harry and Blondie, recently brought together in his new book Blondie in Camera, are more than portraits. They're touchstones of a transformative time in music and in style. Shot with instinct, elegance, and a deep sense of timing, these photographs feel as fresh now as when they were first made. Well, he's worked with countless artists over the decades, from the Jam and Elton John to Brian Ferry. There's something uniquely intimate and enduring about his images of Blondie. They offer a backstage pass, not just to a band, but to a cultural moment that continues to resonate. This is Ivarian X, and welcome back to the Candid Frame. Well, Martyn, welcome to the Candid Frame. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm of the age where, the release of the music of the punk and the new wave era was part of my youth. So to have a chance to take a look at this book and to see images that I was very familiar with from the time and later, it was very cool. And to hear the story behind them, because I had never really heard about the stories behind some of these images that have become very iconic. But before we get into the images in the book, tell me a little bit about the events that kind of led to this, because you'd already had started working as a photographer, first as an assistant and then as a freelancer, going back to around 1974. But tell me about those early beginnings and how you found entree into the world of music photography.
Oh, I was really lucky, actually. I studied photography at Harrow College of Technology and Art. And one of the lecturers there was a guy who was a film cameraman at a film studio called Pinewood. And one of the clients of Pinewood was Gerard Mankiewicz. He was the son of Wolf Mankiewicz, the film producer. And he was very good at doing very large film set type photographs for record covers. So he needed an assistant, just a freelance assistant when he was busy. And the lecturer put me in touch with him, and I just basically fell into it that way.
And you were working in the studio doing a lot more sort of technical stuff, much less creative.
He was a very technical photographer. So I learned a lot from him about lighting and the way to handle artists in that situation. So, yeah, I was very fortunate. And I was also very fortunate in that he didn't like doing any live shoots. So I used to just go out and do live shoots for him. And one of them was a series of, it was all in the glam rock time. And there was several artists like Sweet. These are British artists that probably are not known in the States. But they were bands in this glitter rock era. And I thought, well, hang on, I've taken all these pictures. I mean, I will go and see a few magazines myself, because I was very lucky to be able to get a pass to get into the venues to take the pictures. The pictures worked out great. So I went to the local magazines and said, would you be interested in me doing some stuff for you? And because I had some pictures to show them, they were very sort of supportive, particularly a magazine called Fab 208, which in the UK was a big deal because we had no commercial radio stations really at that time. And so all the pop music and sort of new music came in from Radio Luxembourg. And this was a magazine that was promoted by the radio station. So they got a lot of access to big acts. And so I went and photographed Queen for this small magazine. And the shoot turned out so brilliantly. I used a technique which involved multi-prism lenses, which was very much a cinematic technique.
Yeah.
That, in conjunction with Queen's fantastic stage show and lighting, produced some really sort of dramatic images that not only the magazine liked, but I did, just like I'd gone to the magazine, I thought, well, I think these ought to go along and show the management of these pictures. So I went along and showed John Reed, who was managing Queen at the time, and they said, wow, these are really quite interesting. I think we'll do a special issue for sale. So it was, a lot of it was fortunate of being in the right place at the right time, but I think also trying to have some sort of slightly wacky ideas that were, because at that era, taking pictures of live bands was terribly difficult because the lighting in most cases was poor. The film was slow. I mean, it was probably, I think it was EPT I was using, which is probably 160 ASA, which was not fast. So everything had to be pushed in the processing a couple of stops. But the thing about Queen was that Queen had the most fantastic lighting rig. And by using the multi-prism lenses, magnified the lighting. So we got really dramatic pictures in an era of, very non-dramatic pictures when it came to live, especially in color, which is what I'd shot it in. So this was a springboard into other things.
It's really interesting that you're just playing around, experimenting in a world where a lot of photographers were just falling back on what had already been done. Been playing it safe.
Yeah, I mean, well, probably I didn't know what safe was because obviously the thing about college was I was given a lot of time to experiment. That's what college was about, really, and produce a portfolio. So I was using techniques that I'd sort of used in fashion segments of the college course. I mean, I was never going to get a job as a fashion photographer because I'm not that sort of guy. I'm not a sort of very interested in fashion, but I was very interested in the lighting and the sort of drama that could be produced in the pictures. So I really took the fashions course modules I'd done and put them into rock and roll.
You mentioned, the difficulties of shooting live performances at the time. Obviously, you're dealing with film, lower ISO, poor lighting. So, when you're out there, each venue is going to be completely different. Each club is going to be completely different. Each band is going to be different. That is such a kind of learning curve in terms of figuring how you're going to make it work. Tell me about you sort of getting your sea legs with respect to being able to shoot live, because right now in today's world we're really spoiled in terms of the ability to be able to shoot. But back then there was a lot of things that were very unpredictable, and you were commissioned to deliver results.
Yeah, it was very unpredictable because if you were shooting in a small club, they had very few lights. We used to say they'd have a couple of red lights and a couple of blue lights, and that was the lighting. I would take this Kodak film. I mean, my lenses were not that fast anyway. I think 3.5, f3.5, 50mm lens was all I had. Plus, I used to shoot on an 80mm f2 lens. But, the thing, I just shot it slightly out on a whim and a prayer. But the other good thing, I had a very good relationship with my processing lab. And so they were quite prepared to push E4 film up to 2.5, 3 stops. Now, it meant that you basically didn't have a black in the picture, but you had lots of color and a lot of grain. And to be honest, the magazine editors hadn't seen anything any different because everyone had the same problem. No one could particularly produce a picture in color in these small clubs. And the thing is, when you went on to the bigger bands, like Queen or like Sweet, they had really good lights because they took the lights with them. And they were shooting in venues which were really big old cinemas. So they were 2,000 or 3,000 people. So they realized the problem and they brought their own lights. But you're quite right. In the clubs, it was really difficult because obviously you couldn't use flashlight because the artists refused to sort of have that happen. And the only other way to do it was shoot black and white. And I often shot a couple of rolls of black and white of each shoot. And that's another thing, of course, because the film was sort of rationed because a client would only pay for perhaps 5 or 6 rolls of film for the whole shoot. So you couldn't go blasting away.
Wow.
And so you just had to sort of, you got a feel for what the light was like and what the camera and the film would stand. There was another thing. We always used to clip test everything. So we would cut the first 2 or 3 frames off, run it through and just work out what the film would take in pushing or pulling or whatever you wanted to call it. But you had to have a lab that was prepared to do that. And I had some really good labs. They were very helpful.
The photographing a band or individual performer in a club while they're performing is one thing. When you get them, as a group, say in a studio on location, that's a completely different thing. right? You really don't, when you're shooting them live, there's no real interaction between you and them. But when you're getting them for the purposes of, creating promotional images, it requires a whole different skill set. You mentioned before how, the photographer you were apprenticing under sort of taught you a little bit in terms of how to, work with people and work with groups. But, you really don't get to test your mettle until you're thrown into it. Tell me about some of those earlier opportunities that you had to do just that.
Yeah, well, I actually enjoyed working in the studio. The thing is to approach the studio shoot with an idea, or several ideas, actually. So I would always do this. I would always do a bit of research on who was coming into the studio. The other thing is that there were two levels of studio shoots. Was if you were shooting a shoot for a magazine, you often only got an hour to do it because the band would be moving around from studio to studio for various press engagements. So that was absolutely crucial that you knew exactly what you wanted to do. You had the background set up or a prop set up when they walked in the door. You had the coffee set up, the kettle boiling, your assistant all ready to go. The back's loaded of your Hasselblad camera. So you didn't waste any of that 1 hour. And then the other thing is shoot quickly on those sort of shoots because you knew what you wanted to do. You discussed it with the band briefly at the beginning. If they had any sort of queries or any concerns, I always said to them, well, fine, let's do it my way. We'll also do it your way. And then we'll see at the end, when we process the things, which comes out the way you want to go. And they were fine on that. I never had any real trouble with that. If you were shooting the band for the band by the management or the record company for an album cover, that was a different deal. What you would do is it would take all day. We'd book the studio for the whole day. The guys would come in. We'd make sure that lunch was set for them. I'd always tried to meet them beforehand so we could discuss the plans, what we wanted to do. And so everyone was on board. They had the right clothes. If it was a major shoot with a record cover, we had the hair and makeup, if necessary, for the people. So everything had to run smoothly. But funny enough, the actual shooting time was quite short, which is what they like. I mean, these guys don't like standing around. They don't mind staying there for a few minutes, and they'll work their arse off. But they don't want indecision. They never did, and I tried to avoid indecision.
I have mad respect for people who are able to photograph people against a white seamless. I personally favor doing more environmental portraits where there's a relationship between the subject and the space that they're in. Put them against a white seamless, I am completely at a loss as to what to do.
White seamless is not good. I always used to try and come up with an interesting background. I mean, in the early days, we came up with plastic. We like this highly polished plastic. Worked very well in the late 70s, early 80s. And even painted backgrounds. I used to get scene painters, the painters background. So that was good. The one big session I had with a white seamless, which didn't really work, was AC/DC. I did the first shoot in the UK with AC/DC in 1976. And they came into my studio. I followed all the rules I've just said and tried to plan it all. But after 2 rolls of films, they decided they didn't want to stand on a white background. So I turned around and pulled it down. So the session rather ended abruptly at that point. No animosity, but they decided they'd come again another day. So what I did with the client is I said, well, look, this isn't working. We don't seem to have a chemistry here, but we need the pictures. You need the pictures. I know of an old studio set in Shepperton, which was funny enough, it was the old film set, Oliver, the film. Oh, yeah. I'd used it about 6 months earlier, and I knew they were going to pull it down. So I said, well, why don't we arrange to go out there? The band can, to be honest, if they get aggressive with it and pull it apart, it doesn't really matter because they're going to pull it down. So we went to this amazing old set, which actually looked like a Wild West town, took a few smoke bombs and things like that. And actually the band were as good as gold. They loved it. I mean, we just did all these pictures like they were running out of a bar after, sort of a fight or something. And they totally got into the shoot. And it turned out really well. So it's a good example of, seamless backgrounds. A bit of environmental location stuff can be very good.
Well, the images in this book all happened within a very short period of time, but it was propelled by you sort of reaching out to a publication about photographing the lead singer of Blondie, Debbie Harry. How did that come about?
Well, I'd always been working in this new wave era in 1977. I'd worked with the Jam, I'd worked with the Sham 69, Wayne County and Electric Chairs, all these sort of new wave bands and punk bands. And but I'd also started working for the Sunday supplement called the Telegraph Sunday Magazine, which is a glossy magazine that came out on a Sunday, and it had a very sort of middle class, intellectual sort of audience. So I started working for them, doing sessions with artists and painters and writers. And I was we used to edit all our pictures in the office on the Lightbox. And I was chatting to the art director and the picture editor, and I said, well, there's this amazing singer in New York who worked, is up front for a band called Blondie. That was the connection I had with the record company. She'd make a great cover story for the magazine. So the sort of tyrannical editor, John, he sort of said, okay, we're interested. Give us an idea of what's going on. I said, well, okay, look, I'll go to New York, take a whole set of pictures. I'll pay my own flight. I'd already arranged with the record company, said they'd put me up in a hotel. I said, if you really like the pictures, then we can go ahead and do a story. So they agreed to that because basically they weren't in for any expenses if they didn't like it. So I paid me £100 and went standby, flew across to New York and ended up in the Gramercy Park Hotel, which was fortunate because actually it made such a great location. Debbie Harry and Chris Stein were living there because their flat had burnt down. And so I sort of just ended up in this hotel. I was in the bar before we started, and the barman said to me, well, this is the sort of place that bands stay in on the way up and on the way down. And because it had a great heritage. I mean, the people that stayed there were sort of the Clash had stayed there, Bob Dylan had stayed there. So it was a serious sort of rock and roll hangout, sort of one down from Chelsea, I think. But so I'd instigated the story. I mean, the shoot went so well, I was able to do, I had, again, this battle plan. I'd taken over a suitcase full of equipment so I could build a studio in the suite that they were staying in. Also, the hotel had these amazing locations, like an old cocktail bar, Art Deco, wonderful terrace that looked over on the Chrysler building. So I had really, within walking distance of where they were staying, fantastic backgrounds, locations. Plus, Debbie Harry was terrifically interested in fashion. She was like in the New York sort of fashion scene. I mean, while we were doing the shoot, Stephen Sprouse was in the lounge and Chris Stein talking fashion. So she had the most amazing outfits. That also backed up by, before I left, I contacted the hairdresser that did all my stuff in the UK, a guy called Gregor Schumi, who was in New York to do New York Fashion Week. And he offered to do the hair. So between the combination of Debbie's styling, Debbie's brilliance in front of the camera, and my planning, we got a set of pretty unique pictures.
Yeah, this is before their sort of breakthrough album. They had released, I think, 2 albums by the time you had photographed them. And I think their 3rd album, which became big in the U.S., didn't come out, I think, until 1979. But
Parallel
Lines, yeah. So, but how did you become aware of her to the point that you felt like, wow, she would be really great to photograph?
You've got to remember, they were big in the UK. They were not big in America. And they were very big in the UK. So I knew all about them. And it isn't until recently I found out, because I participated in a BBC radio documentary, well, actually it was radio TV, about Parallel Lines, in the fact that the record company were absolutely so pleased when I went and knocked on their door and said, could I do a story about Debbie Harry and Blondie? Because the PR mechanism within them wanted to lift them from being a New York art punk band into an international band. Because they knew potential was there because they were so successful in Europe and in UK, but they were nothing in America. They could walk around the streets in New York and no one would even recognize them. So the PR, who was Alan Edwards, their private PR, personal PR, he actually helped mastermind this whole thing, because he realised if she was in the Telegraph Sunday magazine, she would explode through all the media, not just the rock and roll and underground press. It would be, TV would pick it up, radio would pick it up, and then it was in conjunction with the record company Chrysalis hiring Mike Chapman to produce the record, and he was the master of pop music. I mean, they became really a super pop band.
When you had the chance to photograph her the first time around, it was pretty much just focusing on her. In the book, you sort of mentioned that you would go out scouting during the day because you knew they were going to be up for an early shoot, and that sort of was really important in terms of you pre-visualizing what you wanted. You talked a little bit about, discussing with a band, for example, what the ideas are, but, you're in New York, for the first time, and you're kind of, discovering the city as you're at the same time trying to figure out where you're going to, photograph, this amazing performer.
Well,
but tell me about, working in that particular way, which is really very improvisational.
Well, I mean, I was there to photograph Debbie Harry. This definitely was not a band shoot, the initial shoot. So I was focused on that because that's how I'd sold the story. And I was totally mesmerized by New York. I'd never been there before. I had to keep pinching myself when I drove in a checker cab over Queensborough Bridge to come in to think that this was actually happening. So I was actually completely gobsmacked by the place, and I loved the skylines. I mean, as a kid, obviously, I'd watched all films of New York and the TV programs, the classic round water towers, the skyscrapers. And because the Gramercy Park was in such a fantastic location in Midtown, when you got up on the roof, you could just have these wonderful backgrounds. And because I'd never been there before, it was all new, and they were a New York band, it seemed logical to make it very New York. So I was just so pleased.
The band hadn't exploded, at least internationally and in the States as of yet. But, Debbie had been photographed, pretty often at that point. How did you find her as a subject, especially since, she had not, gotten to the point where she was photographed so much that she probably grew very tired of it?
I think she actually liked being photographed. And because of Chris's photography, she'd been photographed by Chris constantly. Remember, she'd been in a band before. She was even a Playboy bunny. So she was, and she was a great fan of Marilyn Monroe. So she actually knew her business. I mean, when she stood in front of the camera, you didn't have to pose her. I mean, you didn't have to direct her almost. I mean, it just happened. I mean, she just loved it.
Tell me about, because you were working with, transparent, with film. So you didn't have the immediate feedback that we have today with digital. And, you didn't have a whole lot of rolls of film to be expending on this. Tell me about, just the process you had developed at that time of making sure that you got what you needed.
Well, I mean, obviously there's the technical knowledge, experience of doing it beforehand, of what can and can't be done. Definitely the insurance of having clip tests with my lab, so I could at least see the beginning of the film. I mean, I remember at this time we used to have to pack all our film in lead bags to go even through the airport, because we were always worried that the stuff was going to be X-rayed. And you had a limit of how much film that the client would tolerate or you could carry on the shoot. So, shooting with film was tricky. But the great thing about it is when you finished the shoot, you put the film in the box, and then you went out for the evening. You didn't have to sit in the hotel room working on computers and editing. The editing was quite fun because when you came home, you took it to the lab, you got your view packs back, you laid it on the light box, and then you edited it. I think you're I was professional enough, and I think my colleagues were professional enough to realize that you weren't going to have any real disasters if you followed the rules of photography. I mean, you were professional, you knew how to handle it. There were always going to be situations that might be tricky, and if they were tricky, then you shot them several different ways, or you bracket a bit, just to make sure. But I never sort of really worried about what the result's going to be. In fact, I was always looking forward to it. I mean, I remember I didn't see those pictures. I didn't process them in the lab in New York. I took them all the way home and processed them in London. So for that whole week, I never saw anything I shot.
The images, feel like it was like you hanging out with them for the most part.
Yeah, they were great. They were a great band to work with because it was like Blondie family. You went into the hotel room, and as I say, there were all these weird people there. Like New York sort of art set were there, and there was no, oh, we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. They said, fine, let's do that. If you came up with an idea, yeah, we'll try that idea. We'll do it. It was a very relaxed atmosphere. We used to go out in the evening. I would just jump in the limousine and join them. I mean, I didn't stay all night with them because I was totally fazed by the whole place. But it was wonderful just to tag along. I just used to tag along because I didn't have any expectations. Once I had got my main picture, which I thought was the cover and the main story for the Telegraph, for that whole week, there was no other brief. The Telegraph never said, photograph all the live stuff, go to the Palladium. I mean, it's just that I was there, camera, film, hang on, we might as well go follow and document what's happening.
What was the experience compared to what your expectation was of that entire scene?
Well, it was far more exciting than I thought it was going to be. The other great thing is that in this era, particularly with this band, but in this era, you didn't have corporate PRs or record company people hanging around. You literally just went out and hung out with the band. And the band were the arbiter of what they would do or not do. Whereas nowadays, what I gather, because I sort of packed up a lot of this stuff a long time ago, you have to go through PRs, get approved, show work, and you just were part of the team when you, and so I got far more material than I ever dreamt I would get on that trip. Because to be honest, if I'd have spent a day with them, done the Telegraph shoot, I could have spent 5 days, the rest enjoying a vacation in New York. But it was so much fun that I was not going to do that.
So you go back, you show the editors what you have, but you don't stop there. You end up leveraging that for yet another opportunity. Tell us about that.
Well, my whole career has been leveraging, using material I've just produced to move on to the next level. So I got all these pictures, which had turned out much better than I'd even thought. And the magazine loved it and said they would hold the story for a peg because magazines love to tie it. So they knew when your album was coming out later on that year. So they would use this story for that.
And a peg is what exactly?
Well, in journalistic term, a peg is a reason to run a story, an event. This is a Fleet Street term. Fleet Street's our old newspaper street. And they have terms like peg is that. They have a thing called spike. Now, if the story had been spiked, that means they put it on the spike and it never sees day. It never gets published. So I was pegged, so that was good. I wasn't spiked. I could have been spiked, but I wasn't. So I was in very good relations with the picture editor, Alex Lowe, and he said, well, look, take the pictures if you want, because I wanted to go up to the record company and show what we'd done. And obviously they were interested in seeing what we'd done because it wasn't going to be published straight away. So I took the pictures up to the record company, and I saw a guy called Peter Wagg, who was the art director for the group, and the PR lady called Sue Foster. And they loved the pictures. In fact, they really, these are really nice. So that was great. I had positive feedback. So then I went away, took the pictures back, and then I got a call a couple of days later to say, would you like to go back to New York again? Because we'd like you to photograph the band, because we're desperately short of PR pictures and of pictures we can use for programs, posters, etc., etc. It took me like about 10 seconds to say, yeah, I'd love to go back. So in June, which was literally 4 or 5 weeks after I'd come back, I was back on a plane, this time with my partner as well, who was a picture editor, to act as assistant. And we went back over to New York to do band pictures, very much band-orientated pictures.
And by that time, the identification of the band had really revolved around Debbie. And I remember and was reminded in the book, the whole idea that they came out with buttons saying that Blondie is a band, right? That is it's more than just this lead singer, which eventually created more and more tensions as the years sort of went on. Were you sensitive to that when you were called on to sort of photograph the band and how you had to sort of negotiate the personalities and that obvious, not necessarily simmering tension, but sort of an underlying concern that the members had?
Yeah, I was completely aware of that. I mean, apparently Blondie's name didn't come from Debbie. It came from a cartoon strip in America. I think there was a cartoon strip. And they were a very comic band, especially in their early days at CBGB's. So they had a very sort of comic influence. But, the band was very sensitive, particularly the band sort of was two segments, really. There was Chris, Debbie, and Clem Burke, the drummer, and Nigel, Jimmy, and Frank. They were sort of slightly separate, and particularly Burke had this definite "we must keep as a band" item, and there was never any thought. Debbie never tried to be the front person. She naturally became the front person, but all the time she never pushed that point, and the band kept together in that early stage very well. I mean, but yes, that badge, I've got the band, the badge, which says Blondie is a band. And they all the way through their early part of their career, they definitely pushed that idea, and they were quite sensitive to it. They realised that obviously Debbie would be a magnet for the media, basically. And to be honest, I've done this. I mean, that's what I'd done. I went with my first story, but they quite understood when I came back that I understood that we had to do this was a band shoot, not an individual shoot.
This episode of The Candid Frame is supported by altadinaphotographers.org, a grassroots nonprofit created to help photographers who lost their archives and gear due to the recent wildfires. The organization runs a registry that lets affected photographers list the items they need replaced, from lenses and lighting to computers and film scanners. Donors, both individual and companies, can respond with direct support. It's a photographer-to-photographer system of care and generosity. To learn how you can contribute, visit altadinaphotographers.org. Every donation helps someone get back to doing the work they love. So how did you approach these series of shoots differently than your first outing? Granted that you were, now photographing multiple members of the band.
Well, I mean, the good thing was that obviously I knew them. I'd taken a few prints of the early shoot and they really liked them. And again, I came with very positive ideas. I was going to use the same system, which was a New York skyline for the Best of Blondie album cover. And just like the Gramercy Park Hotel, I used the record plant, again, because the record plant is right by Times Square, uptown. It's certainly near Times Square, and it is in a great location with a great skyline. And it also meant the band didn't have to move. They were recording parallel lines in the building, so I could set up all of my stuff on the roof. They could come up in a break. We could do the shoot, and there was no, this is going to take a day to do. It took like an hour to do that cover. And the other great thing is they were bored to tears recording, because it is very boring, the recording process. And it was a break. It was something for them to do. And I also gave me two pictures of them actually recording in the studio, because I knew Mike Chapman vaguely, and he understood that I needed to get these pictures. So again, it was a little bit of light relief in a difficult recording schedule. Because remember, they're a punk band, they did everything live. The sort of keep doing things with overdubs, etc., was not in their sort of ethos of recording of music, because they loved live. I mean, they were a live band. So yeah, I mean, and the great kick this time was this was all for them. I mean, their manager, the record company, were all behind me, because everything I'm producing was for them. So then that makes a world of difference. A band, I mean, I don't think I've ever really had a problem with any act when you're working for them, because they understand you're a professional, you've got to get it. And usually I have a conversation with them. I mean, the better you get on with these people, the quicker the job's done, the quicker they can get on to doing what they want to do. So speed is an effort, in essence. Whenever a shoot drags on, you're in trouble, really.
One of the unusual pieces of equipment you used was a 500 millimeter mirror lens on the Nikon, which I'm well versed with that lens. To hear, someone using that for portraits, I was amazed by. How did you come to even consider getting that thing? Because it's a mirror lens, so it's a very, very slow lens. It's kind of chunky. Yeah, fake. And you already mentioned how slow the film speeds were at the time. It just like, how does someone come to decide, oh yeah, this is a good investment?
Well, it was a lens I bought because it produced wonderful donuts.
Yeah.
So I thought, and it also was quite light. If I was doing a reportage story out in the field, it was a light lens to carry. Yeah. And obviously I was carrying a lot of equipment to America. So I thought, I'll take the 500. And yeah, I shot it in a 13-foot room. It was just a sitting room in their locale, in their suite. And the speed was not a problem because I was using flash. So I had a big Metz reporter flash, so I could get f8 with no trouble. And it was wacky. And also, obviously, because it's 500 millimeter, it really squashed it. And I mean, Debbie's got a really round face. So you get this amazing moon type face caused by the 500 mil. But you're right. It probably, if you were thinking about doing it today, you wouldn't do it that way. But that was the fun then, because even then, I mean, I've been working for about 4 or 5 years, but I'm still experimenting. And that was a great thing. If I thought I could get away with something, I'd do it one way, and then I'd always shoot a few rolls safe. I'd do something experimental, and then I would just shoot a couple of rolls safe. And the client didn't know. If it was great, I would show the client. And if it didn't work, well, it didn't work. So, but I tried.
And you mentioned the Metz flash, which creates a very distinctive look. I would assume that the use of the flash is just born out of necessity because of the limitations of the, film speed and sometimes you couldn't work with the available light. But
well, in the book, you see the studio setup. Well, I mean, what I did was I took the 500 mil lens and I put the flash right on top of it. It was a reporter. One of the ones that the press guys used with a big battery pack and a square light. And I just put it on a bracket, so it lay virtually on top. So it was almost like a ring flash in a way.
Yeah.
And yeah, there were no shadows really. And it was the biggest flash I could carry to America really in, my suitcase studio kit. I mean, I had much bigger flashes in the UK that I could have used, but obviously not brought to America. Also, they'd been 220 volt against your 110. So I couldn't have really used anything that plugged in that wouldn't work. So really all this stuff is basically what I had and what I could carry.
So when you went back, again, you leveraged it even more by ending up having an exhibition of the images you created, which is completely. I was very surprised by it. I had no idea about that. And I go, oh my God, from a suggestion over a light box, going, hey, I know this interesting performer that I would like to photograph, to having an exhibit of the work. That's just wild.
The story about that is I took the pictures in that I'd taken on this second visit, the ones which were the best of Blondie and the studio stuff and the street photography. So I did a whole set of street photography. And of course, the famous visit to Philadelphia to the Spectrum where they supported Alice Cooper. So we've done all these pictures on the tour bus, pictures of them with Alice Cooper's snake, Julius Squeezer, and all this other stuff. So I took all this back to the record company and they looked at it and they said, wow, this is really nice. Thank you. They're great. And I said, just out of interest, I said, do you know, we've got enough pictures for a photo exhibition. And they turned around and said, well, that's a great idea because we're releasing a record called Picture This from the album. And that might be a great, press session, a promotional gig. We'll get the band to come over and open your exhibition. So they sponsored the exhibition. They found the gallery. I organised all the prints to be done with a lot of friends of mine from the magazines and the record world. We put this together. And, yeah, they organised the band to come and open it. And so they opened it on the 14th of August, 1978, a gallery called the Morandi Gallery. And that brings me to the fact that we're doing the same this year. We're opening Blondie in Camera 1978 on the 14th of August this year. at the Barbican Gallery in London. So we're actually trying to mimic the whole thing.
And I suspect that the prints will be valued far more than they were back then.
Oh, they'll be. Well, actually, they were very. I've still got the price list there because we actually, in that case, we sold the prints for the manager's favourite charity, which was about children's diabetes, because their manager's child, I think, had diabetes. So yeah, we did it was amazing. I mean, it was an amazing year, and that's why we did the book, because I did the book because during the COVID problem, I had time to actually go back and scan, mostly the black and white. I had a lot of the colour were lost in the, like every record business situation. That they take the transparencies, they promise to give them back, they never give them back. Then they move offices and they then trash the pictures, and then they ring you up and say, "Oh, have you got any pictures from that shoot back in 1990?" Anyway, so I had all the negatives. So I spent hours, days, but there was no problem because we were in lockdown. And I went through the whole lot and scanned what I thought would work. And also then I sat and wrote down what I remembered from the shoots. And that's how the book was born. So it was, when we looked at everything, the editor and myself, you could see, well, there was loads of pictures. It actually, and it was an interesting insight into how that era was. It was completely different to the modern era. It was very corporate. It was very much band led. It was very much music led, and interesting individuals. It wasn't tick boxes music. It was non-technical, really, a bit like the photography. Yeah, it was very, well, I call it sort of seat to your pants work. It was what people were doing at the time. And it was great.
Yeah, and it was really in line with what that whole scene was. The punk, especially the punk. It was a reaction to what was happening with the commercialization of rock and roll at the time.
Absolutely.
So
yeah,
they were revolting against that.
It was where in Britain it was called sort of do-it-yourself music, because anyone could get up there on the stage, get a guitar, plug an amp in, and scream down the microphone, and that was it. Democratizing music, I think is the term. But the interesting thing is, I mean, I was never a great fan of any of the particular bands, but it was just the whole group and the people fascinated me. And working with these people, it's I think that's probably been to my advantage, because I'm not a fan of anyone. Because if you're too fan orientated, you're too. I'm very detached from the musicians. I like music, but I like to be not too close to the people. It's just. It sort of works better that way, just sort of, they respect you're there to do your job. And of course, I respect the music, and that's what I want to document.
Did you find that, was it your experience that after these images, started being distributed, that it changed your career? Did you get more opportunities, greater access than you might have had before?
Well, I'd already worked with some of the top bands, so it wasn't so much that. There's two factors. There's one, I think I say in the book, like, I wouldn't have believed that 47 years after I shot the stuff that people would still be really interested in it, because it's a long time for the stuff to still, and over the period of time, you'd be on photo shoots and people would still talk about Blondie and what happened on the Blondie shoots. And I went on to be a car photographer and travel photographer, basically. And I'd be on a car shoot and someone from Audi would say, "Well, you shot Blondie, wow. Oh, that album, wow." So she was still very current, and it still sort of came up in my career. Of course, it was helpful because then I went on to work with several other big acts, and particularly Wham and George Michael. And I ended up in China on the George Michael Wham tour of 1985, 40 years this year.
There's an iconic image that you have of her licking the edge of a vinyl record. One that was at the very end of a shoot. Is that right?
Yeah, well, that was the 500mm shoot, but I didn't use a 500 for that. That was the shot in that studio in the suite. I'd taken planning, we mentioned planning. I'd taken that white vinyl record from the record company, and I asked to kiss it. I thought, that will make a nice picture, profile, kiss record. Had it all set up, everything ready, and I'd done several pictures. And then just right at the end, I said, "Why don't you lick the record?" And she just licked the record, and I wasn't even looking through the button. I just pressed the shutter and caught that picture. And I think I mentioned in the book, about 4 or 5 years ago, I was in London at a record fair, signing some books. A chap comes up to me and buys the book and asks me to sign it. And he said, "Oh, by the way, did you take the picture of the Debbie Harry licking the white vinyl record?" I said, "Well, yeah, it's in the book. This is my book. So yes, I did indeed take that picture." He said, "Wow." He said, "I've shown that to every artist I've signed as a picture of a real rock and roll picture." And he turned out to be Craig Cowman, the CEO of Atlantic Records. So I was very chuffed about that, because it shows. But the picture, it just shows you that it, as a photographer, it's just, 1/25th of a second. That's all you've got.
Right. Yeah, because it's really sort of a testament to the idea. It's like you can preconceive as much as you want. You can have all the technical stuff, but there's just a little bit of serendipity that can elevate a really good shot into something great.
Yeah, it sparks it, doesn't it? It's just a spark that goes there. And that's happened, and that happens it usually happens on a shoot once. You just got to be ready to get it, really. But when you do get it, it becomes, I had to use this terrible word, iconic, but it's become the sort of a standard word. But that has been a very successful picture. And it sort of sums up the shoot, doesn't it, really? I mean, it's amazing what you can do in a hotel room with a suitcase full of rather dodgy old equipment, which is effectively what I had. Because, I was a freelance photographer. Every bit of equipment was my equipment, that well used, because, my stuff got seriously used. Yeah. What
was it like for you going through those images when, during that COVID period, and revisiting those photographs and, and re-experiencing the events of that year?
Yeah, well, in fact, that whole COVID, because I not only scanned that book, but I scanned my vast amounts of my archive. It was wonderful, actually. The travel stuff meant you felt like you were going to places, particularly with the Blondie stuff. You remembered all the things you'd forgotten, really, that they brought back. Like the snake thing. I actually had to go online to find out who Alice Cooper's snake, and I thought sort of Julius Squeezer was a great name, and all these little nuances of things that happened on these trips. And I remember walking around. In fact, for the exhibition, I've been sort of digging out memorabilia, and I found an old New York license plate recently that's going to go on display with the old maps I had, because I just picked that up walking along the street when I was doing my recce's, as you mentioned, when I sort of walked around Midtown looking for places. I was fascinated by, say, an old American car and a tube in the road with steam coming out of it. We didn't have that in London, and it was rather fascinating. Even simple little things like that, which are great fun. So yeah, looking back pictures, every picture's 1,000 words, isn't it? So it really does sort of bring back to memory. It's seeing how young we all were as well. We were all very young, weren't we, in 1978?
It's really interesting talking to photographers, especially who photographed the music scene during the 60s, 70s, early 80s, that, that the images were largely seen as sort of a commodity. It was a way to be able to make rent that week, right? There was no imagining that these images would live on for, decades after they were created. But in hindsight, they come to realize that there's a value to those images as time has sort of gone on. When you look at your work now, and you realize that it's sort of, it's not only a time capsule of a period of time, but it's a really sort of a personal diary of what your life was like.
Yeah, that's what this book, people have said this book is like, it is a diary of 1978 in a period where the band went from New York punk to international stadium artists, FM radio, sort of it's a document of that time. And you're absolutely right that the record companies and the magazines did see the pictures as, this is in this week's issue. We'll move on to the next issue. And that's why these magazines didn't collate and store and archive, particularly in Britain. They didn't archive, all record companies. And that's to their loss, really, because they haven't had archivists and simple people who could, simple storage, even if they didn't catalogue them, just put them in boxes with a year on, because someone later on could catalogue them. But they didn't. They were so busy moving on to the next artist. And remember, at this era, they were actually searching for artists. I mean, especially the punk and new wave. I once did a week where I shot 7 days a week, 2 shoots a day in the studio for a record company called Ario, who were coming to Britain. They were a German record label. And it was like conveyor belts with these bands. They were just searching for these bands, creating a whole new sort of catalogue, basically. Wow. So they didn't have, they were, if the band went on to be wonderful, none of them had the pictures from the original time, I'm sure, unless the photographer was canny enough to keep them.
So with your extensive catalog, are you hoping to produce more books of this sort?
Well, this is the third of a trilogy in a way. That I produced a book called The Jam Sessions. So I did a big shoot for the series of shoots for the Jam. And then I did this, and I produced a book on that called Jam Sessions. And then a second book I did called If You Were There, which was my shoots with Wham and George Michael. But both those books were art books. They were printed by a small label called Ormond Yard Press. And we only produced 500 copies of these books. So this is the first book that is available worldwide, basically. I'd like to do the George Michael and Wham book again, slightly differently, obviously, because obviously it was a limited edition, that book, but we could probably remaster that. And I have got plans for another book, but we're in the middle of talking to it, and I suppose I shouldn't really say. But there should be another book, but not. It's nice. It's nice. I've always liked exhibitions. That's what I've done mostly before, because I can sneak into an exhibition unknown and listen to what people are saying about the pictures, which is it's really nice, because obviously when you work for magazines and record companies, you never really see the people's reaction to the pictures or their comments, because obviously they buy the book and walk away, or the magazine, it's delivered to them. But if you're in an exhibition and you're sitting in the corner, sort of reading a paper or something, you can hear people, lambasting them.
And this was, I think, the only time that you photographed the band. You photograph
Blondie?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. Well, twice. Twice, and of course I did pictures at the opening of the gallery. So pretty intense. And I didn't meet them again until about 8 years ago, and they were playing a gig at Kew Gardens, which is a big botanical gardens in London. And funny enough, I was going off to New York the next day, so I couldn't even go backstage and have a chat with them. I had to literally dash to the airport to get the plane. But no, I'd love to meet her again. I'm in discussions with the management, and that I have been, because they've been really supportive with the book. So and
it was a lovely foreword that Debbie wrote for the book.
She's a lovely lady, and I really appreciated that. It was nice for her to do that. Obviously she must get loads of requests to do things, so it was nice. And as I say, I'm hoping that we might see her at the exhibition sometime, because it goes on for 3 months. So with any luck, she'll be in London at some point between August and January next year. So that's nice. But the book's had very good, it's had good reviews, and I've snuck into a few bookshops to actually see if they had it, and it seems to be well distributed. And I've had a little chat to a few of the salespeople, and they said it's had good feedback. So a bit like it's a bit like the exhibition, sneaking in to get people's reactions to it.
Believe me, when I published my first book, I went straight to my local bookstore. For the gratification of seeing my title on the shelf. So
because as I say, I've done those 2 other books, but they've all been sold in photo galleries and things, so they're all online. They're very they were very fan orientated. They were books for people who really were disciples of the bands, really, to be honest. But it's been, I carried on doing rock and roll, I suppose, to the late 80s. I really finished with George Michael. But I over the years, I just about done all the people of interest. I was so lucky to shoot Genesis, Elton John, these people. And it was a really interesting basket of artists, right from the punks right up to the sort of huge stadium rockers. And the AC/DC shoot, I only ever did one shoot with them, this first shoot in 1976. But it keeps getting used, all the stuff. Even the band used it for their heritage. They did a video about their history, and they used the pictures in that. which is great.
Well, it must be very gratifying to see work that because very few of us can say that, work that we did 40 years ago is still of interest to anyone.
Yeah, well, so I said in the book, I said, I'm really surprised that anyone's interested in the stuff I did 47 years ago. Before I came on this interview, I've been shooting some pictures for the exhibition, and I was shooting a local model in a Debbie Harry T-shirt that Debbie Harry Blondie produced that was marketed in the UK that I've had for about 4 years now in a box. And I thought, well, it'd be really great to photograph the model because I've never actually seen it. And the shoot, it was really fun to shoot. And I don't go out and shoot that often, but that was really great fun to get back out there. I mean, I love digital photography and I haven't shot anything on film since 2005. So I've been 20 years now, totally digital, because it gives you so much more control. And then photography is really about control. I mean, that's the whole thing about that Debbie Harry shoot in the bedroom, the sitting room. The whole thing was I tried to control it as much as I could, and I think vaguely successfully. But nowadays you can control it, and that's what photography is all about, really: light and control.
Well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore on their own, and it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
Who am I going to go with? Now, this is ancient, but my great hero in photography is Lati.
Oh, yes.
We're going back to, 1905. But he's one of my great, because I ended up doing a lot of automotive photography and travel photography. I just love the way this guy caught moments of time in an era where controlling the camera he had absolutely no help with ISO cameras. I mean, but he seemed to catch moments in time that no other photographer of his era did. I mean, he was helped by things like rotary shutters, which gave you that with the car stuff. The whole car would be bent forward and give you a feeling of movement. But he just seemed to have this sort of ability to create, in an era of formality, very informal, candid pictures. But I may say he may be difficult to interview. So,
yes, that would be quite the coup.
Yes. So I'm sorry, it would have to be a research piece. But I once they asked me my top 10 pictures, a magazine, and one of his was sat right in the middle because I've always liked the way he handled things. It's great history.
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful recommendation. And thank you again for making time for me today. I really appreciate it.
I enjoyed it. It's great. It's great to unburden myself of that era.
Thanks to Martyn for sharing the stories behind these timeless images. You can explore his new book, Blondie in Camera, and more of his archive by visiting martyngoddard.com or follow him on Instagram. It's a masterclass in photographing not just faces, but moments that matter. You can also support the show financially through Patreon or through a one-time donation through buymeacoffee.com/The Candid Frame. Your contributions help keep this show going and growing. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our newsletter on Substack. I share personal stories, creative prompts, and behind-the-scenes updates from the show. Join us. Our audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker. And this is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame.